Autumn had always brought with it a certain magic to the town of Blackwood Hollow. The cool breeze, the rustling leaves, and the smell of bonfires carried the promises of the most anticipated night of the year, Halloween. Children, dressed as ghosts, vampires, and witches, would roam the streets as dusk fell, their laughter mingling with the eerie winds of October. But this year, something different lurked beneath the surface. Robert Morton, a man in his late 30s, had lived in Blackwood Hollow his entire life. It was a quiet place, far from the hustle of the city, where nothing unusual ever happened until this Halloween season. As the night of trick-or-treating approached, strange rumors began to swirl among the townsfolk, whispered in hushed voices at the local pub and grocery store. It was the woman, the strange woman handing out the sweets, one mother had said, pale and trembling as she clutched her child. Robert had overheard these snippets as he passed through the town square. Intrigued, he couldn't help but feel the chill of something sinister in the air. A woman, unknown to the town, had appeared almost overnight. She was always seen at twilight, standing outside an old, abandoned house near the edge of the woods. Her long, tattered cloak and pale face unsettled anyone who crossed her path. And she had started to give out candies, small, wrapped chocolates that the children gleefully accepted without hesitation. The trouble began when the children who ate her sweets started changing. At first, it seemed innocent enough, odd behaviors, strange dreams, but nothing alarming. That was until young Tommy Miller's body was found, grotesquely altered. His skin had turned gray, his eyes bulged unnaturally, and his teeth had become sharp, like a predator's. The town was paralyzed with fear. Robert couldn't dismiss the nagging thought that it was connected to the woman in the woods. He decided to investigate. The night was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves as Robert made his way to the old house. His flashlight flickered in the darkness, the beam cutting through the shadows. The house stood at the end of the dirt road, its windows broken and its roof sagging with age. But tonight, there was a light, a dim, eerie glow emanating from within. The woman was there. Robert could see her, standing in the doorway, her bony fingers clutching a basket filled with more of those cursed sweets. A shiver ran down his spine as he approached, the air growing colder with every step. When he finally stood before her, the woman's eyes met his, and for a moment, he felt something ancient and malevolent stir within her gaze. Her lips curled into a smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Would you like a treat?" she asked in a voice that was almost a hiss. Her hand extended the basket toward him, and Robert's heart raced. He stepped back instinctively, his body screaming to turn and run, but something held him there, a dark curiosity, perhaps, or the fear of what would happen if he left her unchecked. He had seen the terror on the faces of the children who had consumed her sweets. He needed answers. "What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely more than a whisper. The woman chuckled, a low, rasping sound that seemed to echo from the depths of the house behind her. "I am the one who brings the old ways back. The children of Blackwood Hollow are only the beginning." Robert's blood ran cold. He had no idea what that meant, but he knew one thing: this was no ordinary woman. She was something far older, something far worse than the town could imagine. As he turned to leave, the sound of her voice followed him, a dark promise hanging in the air. "You cannot escape what has already begun." He hurried back to town, the shadows of the trees seeming to reach for him as he fled. The distant cries of children echoed in the wind, but now they sounded wrong, as if something monstrous had joined them. The town of Blackwood Hollow was draped in an unnatural stillness the following day. The familiar clamor of children playing in the streets had ceased, replaced by uneasy silence. Robert felt the weight of the previous night's encounter pressing down on him like an invisible hand. The woman's words echoed in his mind, "You cannot escape what has already begun." Sleep had eluded him, his thoughts plagued by visions of grotesque transformations, twisted bodies writhing in agony, and whispers from something ancient, lurking just beneath the surface of the world he thought he knew. Blackwood Hollow, in its quiet simplicity, was now a place haunted by a malignant force, a force Robert felt compelled to understand. He found himself drawn to the town's small library, a relic of the past that had survived only because the older residents refused to let it crumble into history. Inside, dust clung to the air, and the dim light through the windows cast long shadows on the shelves. Robert sought answers in the ancient tomes that were forgotten by most, but had always fascinated him with their tales of the occult and folklore. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp, knowing eyes, greeted him with a nod as he approached the desk. Her voice was a rasp, barely more than a whisper. "You seek knowledge, but be wary of what you find here." Robert hesitated. How could she know? But he pushed the thought aside and pressed on. "I need to know about the old legends of Blackwood Hollow. Specifically, witches." The woman's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Robert's face, as if searching for the hidden truths in his request. "There are stories, long forgotten by most, but dangerous to those who dig too deep." Without another word, she led him to a back room where the oldest books were kept, records of the town's founding, folklore of the surrounding forests, and whispers of dark entities that once prowled the land. As she left him there, Robert began to sift through the yellowed pages, his fingers trembling as he uncovered the dark history of Blackwood Hollow. The story of the Witch of All Hallows Eve emerged from the brittle pages of an ancient manuscript, written in a language Robert could only partially decipher. It told of a woman, cast out from society centuries ago, accused of practicing dark magic. The townsfolk believed she had made a pact with a being far older than humanity itself, something from the abyssal depths of the universe. On the eve of All Hallows, she was said to roam the town, seeking vengeance on those who had wronged her. The curse she cast was insidious, affecting the children first, twisting their innocent forms into monstrous mockeries of human life. But there was more. As Robert delved deeper into the text, his heart began to race. The witch was said to return once every century, her presence marked by a year where the children dressed as witches themselves. It was an invitation, a call for her to emerge from the shadows and reclaim what was taken from her. The description was too familiar to be dismissed. The woman in the woods, the strange transformations. Blackwood Hollow was caught in the grip of this curse, and it was repeating itself now, before his very eyes. A chill crept up his spine as he read the final lines of the text, written in a shaky hand. "Beware her sweets, for they carry not the joy of childhood, but the poison of the ancients. The eater becomes the beast she once was. No man is safe from her trickery, no soul beyond her reach." Robert slammed the book shut, his breath coming in short gasps. This was no myth. It was happening. And the woman in the woods was the witch, returned to exact her vengeance. As he left the library, the sky outside had darkened, though the sun had not yet set. A feeling of dread clung to him, like the weight of the town's forgotten history pressing down on his shoulders. He needed to act, but what could he, a mere man with no knowledge of the occult, do against such a malevolent force? That night, the wind howled through the streets, and the eerie quiet returned. Robert paced his home, unable to shake the feeling that the witch's eyes were upon him. The children were no longer safe, the town no longer protected. But there was one thing Robert knew for certain: he could not face her alone. As midnight approached, he could hear the faint laughter of children outside. But when he looked out the window, the figures in the street were no longer children. They were grotesque, twisted beings, their faces warped into horrifying shapes. Some limped, others crawled, their bodies misshapen and monstrous, as if the curse had already taken full effect. And at the edge of the street, standing beneath a street lamp that flickered like a dying star, was the woman. Her cloak billowed in the wind, and her eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, locked onto Robert's window. She knew he had been digging into the town's past. She knew he was the only one who stood in her way. But her smile, the same cold, predatory smile from before, told him she wasn't afraid. If anything, she welcomed the challenge. Robert turned from the window, his heart pounding. Time was running out. He had to find a way to break the curse before it consumed the town, and himself along with it. The following morning, Robert awoke to a pale, suffocating fog that clung to the town like the breath of some ancient, slumbering beast. His dreams had been fractured visions of twisting bodies, grotesque faces, and that woman's cold, predatory smile. The nightmare had blurred the lines between reality and madness, leaving him adrift in a world he barely recognized. As he prepared himself for the day, a gnawing sense of dread lingered at the edges of his consciousness. The fog seemed alive, coiling through the streets and alleyways of Blackwood Hollow, as if it too had been summoned by the ancient curse. The once familiar town now felt alien, like a place touched by forces far beyond human understanding. He couldn't escape the feeling that the ground beneath his feet was somehow wrong, that it shifted subtly, as if a deep, unseen presence stirred just below. Robert's next destination was the town's church, a crumbling old structure that had withstood the test of centuries. It had always seemed out of place in a town as modest as Blackwood Hollow. Its towering spire and archaic architecture suggested it had been built for a much larger, more important city. As he walked, Robert thought of the whispers he had heard about the church's foundation, that it had been constructed over the remnants of something far older than Christianity, something buried and forgotten. When he arrived, he found Father Caldwell standing in the courtyard, his face gaunt and hollow from sleepless nights. The town's only priest had been hearing confessions of nightmares and terror for days now, his parishioners gripped by an unshakable sense of doom. Robert had hoped the old priest might offer some insight, perhaps even a solution to the curse that now held Blackwood Hollow in its malignant grip. Father Caldwell, Robert greeted him, his voice strained with urgency. "Do you know what's happening to the children? Have you seen what's out there?" The priest's eyes flickered with something like recognition, but it was quickly drowned by a veil of fear. "The devil walks among us," he whispered. "There is no doubt of that. But this is beyond anything I have ever known." Robert clenched his fists, trying to remain calm. "It's the woman. The one in the woods. She's not human, Father. She's a witch, something far older than any of us. I found records, ancient records that talk about her. She's using the children." Father Caldwell nodded slowly, his pale fingers clutching the cross around his neck. "I have prayed for guidance, but none has come. The evil here is older than the church itself, older than the ground we walk on. The town was built on cursed land, Robert. The founders knew this, but they believed they could sanctify it, drive out the darkness with faith. But faith can only shield us for so long." Robert felt a chill run through him. "What are you saying?" The priest's voice trembled. "There are old catacombs beneath the church. They've been sealed for generations. The original settlers believed they were built by the witch's followers, her coven. The townspeople burned them, buried them, but their spirits never left. And now they're stirring again." A terrible weight settled on Robert's chest. Catacombs? A witch's coven buried beneath the church? It was too much to comprehend, but the pieces fit together in a grotesque, Lovecraftian puzzle. The woman, the curse, the twisted children, it was all part of some eldritch design, a plan set in motion long before any of them had been born. "What's down there?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. Father Caldwell's eyes darkened. "Only God knows. But if you wish to stop her, you'll need to face it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. That evening, Robert found himself standing at the entrance to the catacombs, deep within the bowels of the church. The heavy stone door had been pried open after centuries of neglect, its ancient runes glowing faintly in the dim light of his lantern. As he descended into the darkness, the air grew thick with the stench of decay and forgotten things. The walls were damp, and the cold earth seemed to press in on him from all sides. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the presence of something otherworldly. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint echoes of his footsteps. But there was another sound, faint and distant, like the whisper of voices long dead. It seeped into his mind, filling him with an inexplicable dread. As he reached the lowest level of the catacombs, he saw it, a vast, circular chamber lined with ancient stone coffins. The air was thick with the scent of rotting wood and old bones. But it wasn't the coffins that drew his attention. In the center of the room was an altar, ancient and weathered, its surface etched with symbols that hurt his eyes to look at. And there, resting upon the altar, was a blackened, twisted figure, a mummified corpse wrapped in tattered cloth, its face contorted in an eternal scream. But the thing that horrified Robert the most was not the corpse itself, it was the unmistakable, writhing movement beneath the cloth, as if something still lived within that long-dead body. Something waiting to be reborn. Before Robert could turn to flee, the voices in his head grew louder, more insistent. They were no longer whispers, they were commands, spoken in a language he could not understand, but one that resonated deep within his soul. The witch's followers were here, their spirits trapped in this forsaken place, and they had been waiting for centuries for someone to awaken them. Robert felt the pull of the dark magic radiating from the altar, a force older than time itself. He realized, with a growing sense of horror, that the curse was not just about the children. It was about him. It had always been about him. The witch had chosen him. And now, he was bound to her will. The suffocating darkness of the catacombs pressed around Robert like the weight of 1,000 souls trapped between life and death. As the cold air gnawed his skin, he remained fixed in place, unable to tear his gaze away from the twisted, mummified corpse lying upon the altar. The cloth that bound the ancient figure twitched unnervingly, like the final breath of something not entirely dead. Robert's mind reeled, torn between the primal urge to flee and a darker, more inexplicable compulsion to stay, to witness the unspeakable horror that was about to unfold. The voices had grown louder now, no longer distant echoes but violent demands inside his head. They tugged at his thoughts, clawing at the fragile remains of his sanity. It was as though the very stones beneath him had absorbed the essence of the witch's curse, pulsating with the power of forgotten rituals. As his lantern's dim light flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls, Robert could feel it, the shift in the air, the swelling presence of something vast, timeless, and utterly malevolent. The ancient symbols on the altar seemed to pulse with life, and the corpse before him stirred as if waking from a nightmare long dreamt beneath the earth. In the silence of that cursed chamber, the first movement was subtle. The twisted fingers of the corpse flexed, and a low, guttural whisper escaped from beneath the cloth. It was a sound that did not belong to this world, a croak of unimaginable age, dripping with venom and malice, more akin to the hiss of a serpent than the voice of a human. Robert stumbled backward, bile rising in his throat as the figure began to rise, slow and deliberate, from its ancient resting place. The mummified thing was no longer bound by death's embrace. its skeletal form unfurled with a terrifying grace, the rotted cloth falling away to reveal bones and decayed flesh that should have disintegrated centuries ago. But worse still were its eyes, or what remained of them. Two blackened, empty sockets, yet somehow they saw him. They saw into him. Robert gasped, his breath ragged as his mind struggled to comprehend the blasphemous sight before him. The witch, this grotesque remnant of a forgotten evil, was alive, animated by the dark magic that had festered in these catacombs for generations. And as she rose, so too did the whispers. They surged in a cacophony, swirling around Robert like a vortex of madness. "You," came the voice, no longer a whisper, but a guttural, rasping sound that echoed off the chamber walls. "You will serve." It was not a request. It was a command, ancient and unyielding, laced with the promise of suffering beyond mortal comprehension. Robert felt his knees buckle as the weight of the witch's will descended upon him like a physical force. His vision swam with images, terrible, fleeting glimpses of a world ruled by this entity, of Blackwood Hollow engulfed in darkness, of its children transformed into hideous abominations, all bound to her malevolent power. "No!" Robert cried, his voice trembling as he fought against the rising tide of insanity. He could feel it, the presence of the witch's followers, their spirits swirling in the catacombs, urging him to surrender, to join them in their eternal service to her. But something deep within him resisted, a shred of his humanity that had not yet been consumed by the darkness. He stumbled backward, barely able to stand as the witch stepped down from the altar. Her body moved unnaturally, jerking and twisting with every step, yet she advanced with a purpose. Her bony hand extended toward him, the stench of decay and ancient magic filling the air. Robert could feel the pull of her power, like invisible chains wrapping around his mind, dragging him closer to the abyss. And then, something unexpected happened. Amidst the maelstrom of horror, Robert's hand brushed against a cold, metallic object, a rusted, old pendant, half buried in the dirt at his feet. His fingers instinctively curled around it, and as he did, he felt a strange warmth emanate from the pendant. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a tiny flicker of hope in the overwhelming darkness. The pendant was inscribed with symbols far older than the ones on the altar, symbols that seemed to repel the witch's influence, if only for a moment. Robert's mind cleared, if only slightly, and with it came the faintest sliver of an idea, a desperate, reckless plan born from the depths of his terror. With trembling hands, Robert lifted the pendant and thrust it forward, holding it between himself and the advancing witch. The effect was immediate. The witch recoiled, her outstretched hand faltering, her voice reduced to an enraged hiss. The shadows that had clung to her form seemed to ripple, as if struggling to maintain their shape. "You think that will stop me?" she snarled, her voice crackling with ancient fury. "Fool, nothing can stop what has already begun." But even as she spoke, Robert could see it, the tiniest flicker of weakness in her ghastly form. The pendant, whatever its origin, had some power over her. Perhaps it was not enough to destroy her, but it was enough to give him time. Time to escape. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Robert turned and fled, his footsteps echoing through the darkened corridors of the catacombs. Behind him, the witch's furious screams reverberated through the stone walls, growing fainter as he ran. But he knew he had only bought himself a brief reprieve. The witch was far from defeated, and the curse that gripped Blackwood Hollow was far from over. As Robert emerged from the catacombs and into the cold night air, the town lay before him, shrouded in the same unnatural fog that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. He could feel it, the power of the witch spreading through the very fabric of the town, warping reality itself. And now, Robert knew, there was no turning back. The witch had risen, and with her, the darkness that had long slumbered beneath Blackwood Hollow. The mist that clung to Blackwood Hollow seemed thicker, heavier, as if it held the weight of something unseen. The familiar streets were now distorted, twisted into grotesque parodies of themselves. Houses that once stood as markers of simple, rural life were now looming specters in the fog, their windows like hollow, black eyes staring into nothingness. The very air hummed with a low, sinister frequency, and Robert could feel it pressing down upon him, pushing him toward the edge of madness. He staggered through the streets, his thoughts a chaotic storm of dread. The pendant still hung from his clenched fist, its warmth flickering like a dying ember against the cold, unnatural presence that pervaded everything. But it wasn't enough, he knew that now. The pendant had bought him time, had momentarily stalled the witch's direct assault, but it could not undo the spell that had already taken root in the heart of Blackwood Hollow. As he moved through the streets, he saw them, shapes moving in the fog. Children, once innocent, now transformed into shambling, distorted figures. Their costumes of witches, ghosts, and goblins no longer playful. Instead, they had become grotesque mockeries of what they had been. Their faces were twisted, their eyes empty voids, their bodies contorted into unnatural angles. They moved in jerking, erratic motions, drawn by the unseen hand of the witch, slaves to her will. Robert's heart pounded in his chest as he ducked into a narrow alley, trying to avoid being seen by the horrid creatures that now roamed the town. The alley was cramped and claustrophobic, and the smell of decay hung in the air like a physical presence. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echoes of the witch's voice called out, a whisper carried on the wind, beckoning her cursed children toward him. Panic surged within him. He could hear them, those twisted children, shuffling closer, their labored breaths rasping through the fog. His mind raced, trying to piece together some kind of plan. The pendant had worked once. Could it work again? Or was he merely prolonging the inevitable? He clutched the pendant tightly, the strange symbols etched into its surface burning into his palm. In the chaos of his thoughts, a memory surfaced, his grandmother's voice, long buried beneath the layers of fear. She had spoken of the old ways, of protective charms, and of ancient things that lurked beneath the world of men. The pendant, perhaps it was more than just a relic. Perhaps it held a deeper connection to the forces that now plagued Blackwood Hollow. A noise, a sharp, guttural cry, shattered his thoughts. One of the creatures had seen him. The thing lurched toward him, its hollow eyes fixed upon him. Robert's breath caught in his throat as he stumbled backward, his body reacting before his mind could fully register the horror before him. The child, no longer a child but a thing of nightmares, moved with a grotesque, spider-like agility, its limbs snapping at unnatural angles as it closed the distance between them. With no other option, Robert raised the pendant, thrusting it forward like a shield. The creature recoiled, its misshapen body shuddering as the ancient symbols flared briefly with a faint glow. The thing hissed, its voice a grotesque mimicry of a child's whimper, before retreating into the mist. Robert's relief was short-lived. From deeper within the fog, more shapes began to emerge, dozens of them, all twisted and malformed, all converging toward him. Their movements were erratic, jerking and twitching with the unnatural fluidity of a waking nightmare. The witch's influence had spread far and wide, and her servants, these wretched creatures, were unrelenting in their pursuit. Desperation clawed at Robert's mind as he turned and fled, the pendant now heavy in his grip. He could hear the chorus of hisses and snarls behind him, growing closer with every step. His lungs burned as he sprinted down the narrow streets, his body aching with exhaustion, but there was no stopping now. He had to find a way out, a way to end this madness. His frantic search led him to the town center, where the old church loomed like a solitary sentinel in the fog. It stood at the heart of Blackwood Hollow, its once proud spire now cracked and weathered, its doors hanging ajar. The church, long abandoned by the townspeople, had been the center of rumors for generations, a place where the ancient had mingled with the forgotten. Instinctively, Robert knew this was where it had begun. The witch's curse had festered beneath the surface of the town for years, and this place, this church, held the answers he sought. It had been the heart of Blackwood Hollow's darkest secrets, the very nexus of the curse that had consumed the town. With a final, desperate burst of energy, Robert pushed through the heavy, creaking doors of the church. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the oppressive silence felt almost sentient, as if the very walls were waiting for something, some unspeakable event to unfold. The pews were lined in rows, draped in the cobwebs of decades long past, and the altar stood at the far end of the room, shrouded in shadow. But it was not the altar that drew Robert's gaze. No, his eyes were fixed on the floor, where a large stone slab had been pried open, revealing a dark, yawning pit beneath. The crypt. Robert's breath caught in his throat. His grandmother's stories of ancient rituals, of sacrifices made in the name of long-forgotten gods, echoed in his mind. This was it, the source of the curse, the place where the witch had drawn her power. The pit seemed to call to him, beckoning him forward with a malevolent whisper that wormed its way into his thoughts. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as Robert approached the edge of the pit. His hands trembled as he raised the pendant once more, its warmth growing in intensity as he stepped closer to the dark abyss. The pendant's symbols glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows on the walls, but it was clear that its power was limited. The witch had drawn her strength from something far older, far darker, than anything Robert could comprehend. And as he stood at the edge of the pit, staring into the endless blackness below, he realized that the true horror was not the witch herself, but what lay beneath, waiting, watching, hungering. The ground trembled beneath his feet, and from the depths of the pit came a low, rumbling growl. It was a sound that did not belong in the world of men, a sound that stirred the very essence of fear within him. Robert took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The witch was merely the harbinger. What lay beneath was the true terror. Robert stood frozen at the edge of the pit, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The growl from below resonated through the stones, a rumble that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the earth itself. His mind, already stretched to the brink of madness, struggled to grasp the magnitude of what lay beneath. He had thought the witch was the source of the terror that plagued Blackwood Hollow, but now, standing on the precipice of an ancient and unspeakable evil, he realized how naive he had been. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a chorus of malevolent voices that gnawed at the corners of his sanity. They called to him, beckoned him to descend, to join whatever dwelled in the abyss. The pendant in his hand flared once more with warmth, but it felt futile, like a candle against the vastness of the cosmic void. Suddenly, the shadows in the pit began to shift, swirling as if stirred by an unseen force. The darkness took shape, rising from the depths like smoke. And from that darkness, a form began to emerge, something vast, ancient, and terrifyingly formless. Its presence defied comprehension, a mass of writhing tendrils and shifting limbs that seemed to flicker in and out of reality, as if it existed in a dimension beyond human understanding. Robert's mind reeled. His thoughts, once anchored by the rational, were now overwhelmed by the sheer enormity of what he was witnessing. This thing, this abomination, was older than time itself, a manifestation of the primordial chaos that had existed long before man had taken his first breath. It was the source of the witch's power, the dark force that had slumbered beneath Blackwood Hollow for eons, waiting for the moment to awaken. And now, it had been stirred from its slumber. As Robert stared into the writhing abyss, he felt his will begin to erode. The voices, those insidious whispers, gnawed at his mind, urging him to step forward, to surrender himself to the darkness. The urge to comply was overwhelming. The terror was so vast, so all-encompassing that resistance seemed meaningless in the face of such cosmic horror. Just as his foot hovered over the edge of the pit, something snapped within him. A memory, distant and faint, of his grandmother's voice, cutting through the fog of his terror. Her words echoed in his mind, a warning about the old ways, about forces that man was never meant to understand. And with that memory came a surge of clarity, a final vestige of hope in the face of oblivion. With trembling hands, Robert clutched the pendant and whispered the words he barely remembered, words of protection, of warding off the darkness. His voice was weak at first, but as he spoke, the pendant grew warmer, its glow intensifying. The symbols etched into its surface began to shimmer with an otherworldly light, and for a brief moment, Robert felt something stir within him, a connection to something ancient and pure, a force that opposed the darkness that had consumed Blackwood Hollow. The thing in the pit recoiled as the light from the pendant grew brighter. Its formless body writhed and twisted, its tendrils lashing out in fury. The ground beneath Robert trembled violently, and the air was filled with a cacophony of guttural roars and dissonant whispers. But the pendant's light continued to grow, driving back the shadows, pushing the ancient evil back into the abyss. With a final, desperate cry, Robert flung the pendant into the pit. The air seemed to shimmer as the pendant disappeared into the blackness, and for a moment, all was still. Then, there was a blinding flash of light, a burst of energy so intense that it shook the very foundations of the earth. The church walls trembled, the stones groaning under the strain, and from deep within the pit came a sound, a deafening, otherworldly scream, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Robert was thrown to the ground as the force of the explosion knocked him off his feet. He lay there, dazed and disoriented, his ears ringing and his vision blurred. The light from the pendant had faded, and the pit was once again silent, the ancient evil seemingly vanquished. For a long time, Robert lay there, breathing heavily, his body trembling with exhaustion. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet and staggered toward the church doors. The fog had begun to lift, and as he stepped outside, he was greeted by the sight of the town, quiet, still, and eerily empty. The twisted creatures that had once roamed the streets were gone, their bodies dissolving into the mist that hung like a shroud over Blackwood Hollow. But the town was not the same. The darkness that had plagued it for so long had left its mark. The buildings stood like hollow shells, the streets empty and devoid of life. Blackwood Hollow had been scarred by the witch's curse, and though the immediate threat had been vanquished, Robert knew that the town would never truly be free. As he walked away from the church, Robert cast one final glance back at the ruined structure. The pit was sealed once more, but the knowledge of what lay beneath still weighed heavily on his mind. The witch had been defeated, but the ancient evil she had served was far from gone. It had merely retreated, waiting, watching for another opportunity to rise. Robert knew that he had been lucky to survive, but the experience had changed him. He had looked into the abyss, had seen the horrors that lurked just beyond the veil of reality. And though he had emerged from the darkness, he knew that the shadows would never truly leave him. As the fog slowly dissipated and the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Robert disappeared into the distance, leaving Blackwood Hollow behind. But the whispers, the faint, insidious whispers, followed him still. The darkness had been pushed back, but it had not been defeated. It was only waiting. The end.